Recently, the Turkish parliamentary and presidential elections took place, which for the first time in over a decade saw President Erdogan's grip on power seriously challenged, needing a second round in the presidential elections to maintain in power and win the election. This result came as a shock to many Western observers, as not only did Erdogan do much better than in the polls, a majority of the Turks living in Western Europe also voted for Erdogan, and there seemed to be a genuine disbelief in the West on why anyone would vote for him. Western media often depicts Erdogan as an autocrat, an Islamist, a nationalist, or just as straight up incompetent. And there does seems to be somewhat of a basis of truth in these statements, yet it completely ignores the actual valid reasons some Turks might have to vote for Erdogan, because these reasons are definitely there. So let's find out. What are the good things Erdogan has done? Why do Turks time and time again vote for Erdogan as their president? I want to start out by saying that by no means am I an Erdogan supporter. I myself am not a Turkish citizen, I do not have Turkish ancestry, and by no means am I involved practically or emotionally with the recent elections. But there does seem to be a large gap in understanding in the West of Turkish domestic politics, which we intend to fill right here, right now with this video. To understand the domestic political issues, we will first need a short history lesson on how and what values Turkey was founded upon. At the end of the First World War, Turkish militias rose up to seize power from the Ottoman government, who cooperated with Allied occupation in what is now known as the Turkish War of Independence. Chief of those militias was the primary founding father of Turkey, their George Washington, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Atatürk abolished the Islamic Caliphate, a title which belonged to the Ottoman Sultan, and quickly started modernizing and westernizing, in his own words combining the best feats of fascism and communism. He westernized the country along 6 main principles, which he called the 6 arrows. The 6 arrows represent the 6 values Atatürk founded his new state upon: republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism, reformism, and laicism. Of the 6 arrows, the one which is most relevant to the recent election and the rise of Erdogan is the pillar of laicism. Before we find out why Turks vote for Erdogan to such a degree, we first have to delve into the term laicism. Laicism is the ideology of secularization in Turkey, originating and modeled after France. Most people have a basic grasp of what secularism is, but especially in Turkey it is way more complex than it might seem at first glance. In normal secularization there is a separation of church and state. Churches might hold an opinion on public policy and endorse policy change, but they cannot directly themselves decide government policy, nor can the government influence or decide on religious questions, something which they before secularization often did do. How this looks in practice differs per country, as countries like the United Kingdom do have a state religion and their head of state is the head of the church. But the United States' approach is quite the opposite, yet they still consider themselves both to be secular. What constitutes a religion also differs per country, as in the United States basically anyone can found a religion for any purpose, but countries like Germany are much more strict. Thus, unlike the United States, in Germany Scientology is not considered to be a religion, but the overarching approach of these countries to secularism is still quite similar, unlike the laicism approach. Laicism in essence separates the world into 2 parts, public life and private life, and states that religion should only be part of the private life area. Religion should thus be excluded from the public area in its entirety. That means no public displays of religion in public, no religious influence in things like schools and hospitals, and often it even means that there is an active government involvement in religious institutions to box religion into only the private sphere, and to make sure religious institutions do not challenge this relationship. This explanation might still be a bit abstract, so let's have a look at the history of laicism to get a better understanding of that term. Laicism finds its roots in the French Revolution. Prior to the French Revolution, the power of the church was well cemented into French society. The clergy was the first of the free estates in the Estates General, and Catholicism was the state religion. In 1789, the French Revolution took off, angered by the decreasing living standards due to the looming bankruptcy of the French state. Let's see how the relationship with the church developed during these revolutionary years. In 1789, the church lost the right to levy taxes. Their status as an estate in the Estates General and thus direct political power by the church got abolished, and all church property, like churches and monasteries, were seized. In 1790, the special privileges the priests had were removed, and the priests became state employees instead of working for the church. In 1791, all priests had to make an oath of allegiance to the French state. Many priests and virtually all bishops refused to do this, stating that their only allegiance is to Rome and to God. In 1792, divorce became legal, registry tests were taken over by the government, and near the end of the year is when the French Revolution truly started to derail. This is where thousands upon thousands of clergy and nuns were murdered by angry mobs. In 1793, the word Sunday was replaced, removing the Christian connection. The calendar was also deemed too Christian, and all traces of Christianity were removed, introducing a 10-day week, with the year 0 being the year of the Revolution. And all clergy which refused to take an oath of allegiance to France got the death penalty. Furthermore, the Catholic Church in France was was officially abolished and replaced by a cult of reason where people could pray to science and philosophers. We can see that the revolution really was the culmination of the materialist philosophies of the Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, and that their strong dislike of the church had a very big impact on the revolution. This does, however, not mean that there already was a strong philosophical understanding on how laicism or secularization should look like. Everything happened during the revolution years quite impulsively. People took action first and would think about how it should look like later. One of these people who would normalize the situation a bit was Napoleon. He himself definitely was not a fan of the church. He even had the Pope kidnapped at some point. But he finally made an agreement with the church on how to move forward, called the Concordat of 1801. A few highlights of the Concordat: the reintroduction of Catholicism as the state religion of France. The French state would henceforth be the one who nominates bishops. The Pope can still depose bishops, but not nominate them. Priests would still be state employees and swear an oath of allegiance to France, and Sundays would return. This Concordat was the law of the land for over a century and is still in place in Alsace-Lorraine. Since in 1905, when a new law replaced the Concordat, Alsace-Lorraine was not a part of France. The law which replaced the Concordat was the 1905 secularization law. This is where the Laicism philosophy was truly formalized and became a more permanent part of the relationship between the church and the French state. This law was definitely not a relaxation of the relationship with the church. It was brought forward by a socialist, anti-clerical government. The Papal States even broke off relations with France following the enactment of this Laicist law. So let's have a look at what laicism in practice looks like. The 1905 law ended Catholicism as the official state religion. Church marriages became unrecognized in favor of civil marriages, working on Sundays became legal, conscription was introduced for the clergy, religious schools and hospitals became illegal, soldiers were prohibited to go to church, a full ban on state funding to religious services or events, religious organizations would not be allowed to make political statements, and all religious symbols would be banned with the sole exception for a church, cemetery or on a monument. So what is laicism? We already mentioned that in essence laicism separates the public and private sphere and limits religious influence solely to the private one. But as we can see, this is a much different approach than regular secularism. The French state to this day appoints Catholic bishops, Protestant pastors and Jewish rabbis and maintains an active involvement with the religions. The secularization is not a separation between church and state, but laicism subverses the church and religious influence to the state. There is a reason that laicism is a bit of a controversial approach to secularization. In all fairness, there are some genuinely religious people supporting it. But to me, in my personal opinion, it does kinda seem like a hidden form of state atheism. That laicism is a philosophy supported and implemented by people who genuinely dislike religion, and if given the chance, without it creating a full-on revolt, would happily fully abolish any and all forms of religion. Turkey is often viewed as a quite religious country, yet it may surprise many that laicism too is the form of secularization in Turkey. Turkey's founder, Ataturk, was a big proponent of laicism. One cannot underestimate the popularity of Ataturk in Turkey. He did not only found the modern Turkish state, but he was the man to radically westernize society. There were two different philosophies towards the role of religion in society within Ataturk's advisors. The Islamist reformers. They were a fan of the Protestant Reformation and saw the Reformation as the prerequisite for the social revolution in Europe, leading up to the Enlightenment. They wanted the Turkish state to be their Islamic version of Martin Luther, to reform the faith, throw out old holy customs and modernize it to fit it with a more modern state. On the other side were the Westerners faction of advisors. We often only saw a limited role of a reformed religion in the westernization process. And after westernization, religion would have its role fulfilled and could be fully abolished. Whether Ataturk himself was a Muslim is still debated amongst historians. He himself publicly claimed he was, something passionately supported by Turkish historians, but other historians are a bit more skeptical of these claims. Not only due to the anti-religious reforms he made or the people he surrounded himself with, but he also in speeches did things like referring to Islam as the Arabic religion, thus distinguishing it from Turkish identity. So let's have a look at what Ataturk did in his westernization process. He ended school segregation by gender, adopted the Western calendar and alphabet and the European work week. He banned religious education, banned religious institutions to become political, and he banned headscarves in all public spaces, even in schools and hospitals. Not only for the teachers and doctors, but for patients and school children as well. On top of that, he created the Diyanet, a sort of powerful ministry of religious affairs. The Diyanet's primary responsibility is to not let religion harm the secular identity of Turkey. All mosques fall under the authority of the Diyanet. Non-state approved Islam does not exist in Turkey, and the state has a high level of involvement with religious affairs. All funding of mosques is done by the Diyanet, all imams are trained and schooled by the Diyanet, and all imam preachers have to be approved by the Diyanet. Basically all tasks which one would expect to fall to a church council are now done by the Turkish state. To a lesser extent this was already the case. Prior to Ataturk, when the position of Caliph, a sort of Islamic pope, was combined with the position of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But the Sultan was a religious man. When Ataturk assumed power, religious decision-making fell into the hands of people who fundamentally disliked religion and Islam. Especially the ban on headscarves became a prominent and heated political issue in recent times. It wasn't just meant for state employees, but if you were a student going to college or simply a patient wanting to visit a hospital, there too you would have to remove your headscarf. In addition, this generally set a tone where private companies too banned headscarves, and there were even situations where teachers were denied a promotion because they wore a headscarf outside of work times. The issue was so polarizing that the previous president of Turkey, of the CHP party, at some point held a ball and refused entry for all politicians whose wife wore headscarves. In this way we can definitely see laicism as an anti-religious movement. Erdogan has been the most powerful man in Turkey for the past 20 years. He is the one who overturned some of these laws, like the ban on headscarves in 2013, and thus for many Turkish Muslims, Erdogan is the man who gave them back their religious freedom. If there ever was an election to beat Erdogan, it was this one. Never before was Erdogan challenged enough to need a second round in the presidential elections. Economic conditions in Turkey have worsened the past few years, with inflation going through the roof. And other mismanagement problems definitely did not put Erdogan in a good spotlight. So imagine, if you are a practicing devout Muslim, would you ever vote for the CHP opposition party, knowing that they're a full supporter of laicism and quite anti-religious? For many Muslims, these kind of laws are a direct attack on their identity, because religion is often one of the core tenets of one's identity. So even if they do not like Erdogan, for many Muslims the CHP would be a bridge too far to replace him, so they end up sticking to Erdogan instead. This also explains the big gap between Turks living in Western Europe, who by a huge margin vote for Erdogan. They simply are quite religious and implicitly they cannot support the CHP. Unlike countries like the United States, where the Turks tend to be a lot less religious and by a large margin support the CHP. Erdogan was not the first to complain about these laws, but he was the one who was able to repeal them. In 2004, the European Court of Human Rights took on a case brought forth by a Turkish student, who first was rejected from exams and later expelled for wearing a headscarf in college. The court ruled in a controversial and non-unanimous decision that the headscarf ban did not impede the freedom of religion cited in Article 9 of the European Convention of Human Rights. But this decision remains controversial to this day. Here in the West we seem to be flabbergasted as to why Turks would vote for Erdogan. We are fully aware of the mistakes and wrong things Erdogan did, but we tend to not be aware of the full picture. For many practicing Muslims, voting for the opposition party is simply not an option, because for them, the CHP's assault on religion is a direct attack on their identity, and many would rather live in declining economic conditions than not feel welcome in their own home country.